So a man is at his house. It's late at night, and he's about to go to bed, and there's a knock at the door. And he goes to the door, and it's a snail. And the snail says, "I'd like to talk to you about buying some magazine subscriptions." And the man is furious that he's been interrupted, and he rears back and he kicks the snail as hard as he can, slams the door, goes to bed. 2 years later, there's another knock at the door. He opens it, and it's a snail, and the snail says, "What the f*** was that all about?"
Hi, and welcome to Honto Ego, Japan's only 99.9% English podcast hosted at my dinner table. My name is Matt, I'm a Canadian living in Japan, and for today's episode, I'm going to do an author recommendation. Alright, I'm going to recommend you an English author who I really enjoy. So for my first author recommendation, I'm going to be talking about David Sedaris. David Sedaris. Have you heard of David Sedaris before? In case you haven't, he is an American writer born in 1956, and he is primarily an essayist, meaning he writes essays. Why would I recommend someone who writes essays? These are not the kind of essays you think of. This is not like an argumentative essay for the Aiken test or for the TOEFL test. The essays that David Sedaris writes are what I would call a narrative essay, in that he tells a story about his life, or he talks about a real world subject. So it's not fiction, it's nonfiction, but it reads just like a comedic short story. He's a very funny writer with a very unique sense of humor. I will warn you, as you heard in the intro, sometimes his humor can be a little bit dirty. He can use some bad language. But I think that he writes with a very straightforward and easy to understand language. And he writes about a lot of topics that are well known to many people, while providing a unique perspective on those topics. So a few of the things that David Sedaris writes about, primarily he writes about family. He has a big family. They're all living in America, but they have Greek origins. And he writes a lot about his sisters. He has many sisters. He has like this crazy younger brother who he writes about. And he writes a lot about his father too. He has kind of a difficult, rocky relationship with his father, and he writes about him a lot. He also writes about his experience as a gay man in America, which is quite unique. He's born in 1956, so he's 65, 66 years old. So it's interesting to hear the perspective of a gay man who came out and has been married to another man for a long time, Some other topics that David Sedaris writes about are traveling around the world. He loves to travel and he loves to shop, but he doesn't go shopping for typical things. He loves to go shopping for unique and crazy items that he often gives away to his friends as a gift. So he has a lot of stories about these kind of shopping, expeditions, these adventures that he goes on. So I'm going to recommend a few books written by David Sedaris and talk about a few stories or essays within those books that I recommend. The first book that I'll recommend, and probably his most famous book, is called Me Talk Pretty One Day. It was published in 2000. That title again is Me Talk Pretty One Day, right? As you've probably noticed, it's grammatically incorrect, right? Me Talk Pretty One Day. The title of the book comes from the titular story, Me Talk Pretty One Day. A titular story, it has the word title in it. It's the story whose title becomes the title of the whole book, right? It's also common in music albums, right, for the titular song, that the album is named after. But anyway, back to Me Talk Pretty One Day. The essay, Me Talk Pretty One Day, which you can probably Google and read online to give you a taste for his writing, the story involves David moving to France, because being a writer, he's kind of able to move around the world and live in different places, right? And still do his work. So he moves to France with the goal of learning the French language. And so he starts as, kind of a middle level learner, I would say. And he joins this French class with this really, really strict teacher who is kind of openly shaming him and insulting him in French and saying, you're an idiot and you don't even understand what I'm talking about, do you? Right? So the story is kind of about him gradually catching on to the French language, and getting along with his crazy classmates, and eventually confronting his mean, cruel teacher. That's a great story, and the rest of the collection is great as well, with stories about his family, and things like that. The second book of his that I'm going to recommend is a book from 2004 called When You Are Engulfed in Flames. That title again is When You Are Engulfed in Flames. The reason I recommend this book is because a huge chunk of the book is David moving to Japan. So I thought it would be relevant to Japanese readers and Japanese listeners. So the reason why David moved to Japan, he moved to Hiroshima for, I think, 3 months with the goal of quitting smoking. Now, I find that kind of ironic because smoking is, much more popular and much more common, I think, in Japan, especially in the 2000s than it was in America. But I believe that his reasoning for moving to Japan to quit smoking was that, this new environment would provide him with a bunch of challenges in life, and, he would have other things to focus on besides smoking. I believe he wanted to quit smoking cold turkey, as we say, right? Meaning just completely stop one day and never smoke again. So he has lots of funny observations about Japanese people, Japanese society, and he even learns the Japanese language to some degree. And it's worth reading because he often returns to Japan in his life, and he writes about Japan a lot in various essays. And he'll often use the Japanese language, in his jokes. So he has this kind of deep respect for Japan, especially for Japan's kind of wacky, goofy side, right? He loves Japanese fashion. Like I said, he loves shopping, and he'll seek out the most crazy fashion stores in like Harajuku, right? And he'll bring them back to America and give them to his sister or to his friends. So in that book, When You Are Engulfed in Flames, the specific essay where he moves to Japan, it's the last essay in the collection, I believe, and it's called The Smoking Section. The Smoking Section. So there's another essay that you can Google and kind of read to get a taste for David Sedaris. Now, rather than recommend another book by David Sedaris, I want to recommend his audiobooks. Now, something really unique, I think, about David Sedaris is that he often tours around America and he tours around Europe promoting his books whenever he writes them. And he's written a lot of books, right? He's written many collections of essays. So he'll tour around and he'll do book readings where he reads essays from his book, right? On top of this, he also records audiobook versions of each of his books with he himself reading it. So I think, if I can hear the author of a book reading their own book, I think, that's one of the best ways to hear it, right? You can really hear the author's intention behind the book and how they want it to be read. The other interesting thing about David Sedaris' audiobooks is that he often records them half on stage, meaning, for many of his stories, you'll hear him reading it in front of a large audience, in front of a crowd, and you can hear the audience react and laugh to his jokes that he writes, right? I think that's quite unique, especially for someone learning English. The humor in his stories might be a little bit hard to pick up on when you're reading the story, but when you're hearing him say it, it reads just like a joke, and you can hear the punchline. You can hear his voice build up to the joke, and then you can hear the payoff of the crowd laughing. So for that reason, I would recommend listening to David Sedaris' audiobooks. You can buy them on, any audiobook store like Audible. You can listen to pieces of them on YouTube, I'm sure, right? For me, I use a library app called Libby, Libby, Libby. And if you use Libby and you have a library, I use a library from Canada, you can often rent books and audiobooks from your library through the Libby app. So I've read a lot of David Sedaris' books, but I believe I've listened to each one of his books multiple times. I often go back and I re-listen to his books just because, they're not too long and they just always make me laugh, right? They're just so entertaining. One last recommendation I have for David Sedaris' work, to really get a feeling for his style of humor, for his style of comedy, right? I would recommend the story that kind of launched his career or launched him into fame. And that story is called The Santaland Diaries. The Santaland Diaries. And this story is about David's time when he was younger, working as an elf at a mall where they had a Santa, as in kids come to the mall to meet Santa Claus, right, and sit on his lap and, tell him their wish. And so David was one of the elves working for the Santa. And he kind of writes about the behind the scenes of working as an elf. And it's very, bitter. It's very kind of dark, negative humor. And it's a great balance with all of the Christmas imagery. So that's actually a story that I listen to each Christmas. That story was first, I believe, broadcast on NPR, right? America's National Public Radio. I believe it was broadcast on the program This American Life. And as a side recommendation, if you haven't ever listened to This American Life, they release it as a podcast. So if you're listening to Honto Ego on Spotify or any podcast service, you can jump right over and search up This American Life. Great podcast with a mix of fiction and nonfiction kind of essays and news stories. Very, very entertaining show, and David Sedaris often comes onto it. While I'm at it, another podcast that David Sedaris is often featured on is the long-form interview podcast Armchair Expert. I'm a big fan of the podcast Armchair Expert, and I believe David has been on and he's been interviewed, I think, 4 times. So if you'd like to hear him having a conversation, and kind of hear more of his humor, Armchair Expert is a good place to find him as well. All right, well, that's it for today's author recommendation. Again, please check out David Sedaris, and I hope you enjoy him as much as I do. If you find his humor to be difficult at first, don't worry if you're not laughing out loud. I think that he also tells just interesting stories, and often they're very emotional, often they're very wise. He makes great observations about daily life around the world. So, as always, please follow Honto Ego Pod at Instagram. That's Honto Ego, HONTOEIGO, Pod, POD for podcast. Honto Ego Pod on Instagram. And if you have a topic suggestion for a topic that you want me to talk about on the show, you can email me at hontoego@gmail.com. Thank you for joining me at my dinner table, and until next time, just read a book, any book, come on. Bye now.